I remember a time when my world felt very small. I lived in a beautiful town with green trees and friendly neighbors, but for me, the world ended at the borders of my city. I spoke my native language, I ate local food, and I watched local news. On the outside, my life looked normal. I had a steady job, a small apartment, and good friends. But deep inside, I felt like I was living behind a high wall. I could see the sky above the wall, but I could never see what was on the other side. My biggest struggle was a lack of confidence. Whenever I saw a group of tourists in the city center, I would walk the other way. I was terrified that someone would stop me and ask for directions. I was afraid they would say hello, and I would just stand there with a blank face. This fear made me feel very lonely, even when I was around people. I felt like I was missing out on a giant conversation that the rest of the world was having. There was one specific moment that I will never forget. I was working in a small office as an assistant. My boss came to me with a thick manual for a new computer system. He looked at me and said, "I need you to learn how this works by tomorrow." I opened the book and my heart sank. It was all in English. I looked at the diagrams and the bold headings, but the words were just a jumble of letters. I felt a wave of heat rise to my face. I wanted to tell him that I couldn't read it, but I was too embarrassed. I spent the whole night trying to use a dictionary for every single word. By 3 o'clock in the morning, I was crying. I felt so limited. I felt like a child in an adult's body because I couldn't understand something so basic. Opportunities always seemed to pass me by. I remember my friend Sarah telling me about a job opening at an international company. She said, "You have the skills they need. You are great at organizing and people love you." But when I looked at the job description, the first requirement was fluent English. I didn't even apply. I told myself that I wasn't smart enough. I told myself that languages were for other people, people who were born rich or people who had traveled. I stayed in my small job doing the same things every day, feeling more and more frustrated with my own silence. This frustration turned into a quiet kind of sadness. I would watch movies with subtitles and wonder what it felt like to actually hear the actor's voice and understand their emotions directly. I felt like I was living a translated life. Everything I knew about the world came through a filter. I didn't have my own voice in the global community. When I went to sleep at night, I often dreamed of being in a different place, speaking clearly and laughing with people from far away. But when I woke up, the wall was still there. It was tall, gray, and very quiet. The worst part was the feeling of being trapped in my own potential. I knew I had ideas. I knew I had stories to tell and things to share. But because I didn't have the language to express them, those ideas stayed locked inside my head. I felt like a bird in a cage that forgot how to sing. I was 25 years old, and I felt like my life was already finished. I thought this was just who I was. I was the person who stayed in the shadows. I was the person who didn't speak. I accepted that my world would always be small and that the English language was a secret code that I would never be able to crack. The moment that changed everything happened on a very ordinary Tuesday. I was sitting in a crowded cafe, trying to enjoy my coffee and escape the rain. At the table next to me, there was a woman. She looked about my age, but she seemed so different. She was typing on a laptop and talking on her phone. She was speaking English. Her accent wasn't perfect and she made a few mistakes, but she didn't seem to care. She was laughing and explaining a project to someone on the other end of the line. She looked so free. I watched her for a long time. She wasn't a genius or a movie star. She was just a regular person using a tool. That tool was English. I realized in that moment that English wasn't a secret code for the elite. It was a bridge. It was a way to connect. I looked at my own hands and thought, why not me? Why can she do it and I can't? The thought was scary. It was much easier to stay in my comfort zone and say I can't do it. But that day, the pain of staying the same became greater than the fear of changing. A week later, I had a job interview for a position I really wanted. It was for a local company, but they had clients in Europe. The interview started well in my native language. I felt confident. Then the manager leaned forward and said, "We have many clients who speak English. Can we try the rest of the interview in English?" My heart started pounding against my ribs. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I managed to say, "My English is not good." He smiled kindly but looked disappointed. He said, "That is a shame. We really like your experience, but we need someone who can communicate with the team." I walked out of that office and sat on a park bench. I didn't cry this time. Instead, I felt a cold, hard determination. I was tired of losing. I was tired of saying no to my own future. I went to a bookstore that afternoon. I walked past the novels and the cookbooks and went straight to the language section. I picked up a basic English grammar book and a notebook with a bright yellow cover. The yellow felt like hope. I was terrified. I thought about all the times I had tried to learn a few words in school and failed. I thought about my age. I thought, maybe I am too old to start now. My brain is not a sponge anymore. But then I remembered the woman in the cafe. I remembered her laughter. I wanted that laughter for myself. I wanted to be able to sit in a cafe and talk to the world. That night, I opened the yellow notebook. On the first page, I wrote, "Today is the first day of my new life." It felt dramatic, but it was true. I didn't have a teacher. I didn't have much money for expensive courses. All I had was a book, an internet connection, and a very strong reason to keep going. I started with the most basic things. I am. You are. He is. It felt silly and simple, but I stayed focused. I felt a tiny spark of excitement. It was the first time in years that I felt like I was moving forward instead of standing still. I knew the road would be long, and I knew I would make many mistakes, but the decision was made. I was going to learn English, or I was going to die trying. My learning journey was not like a movie. There were no fast montages where I suddenly became a master in 3 minutes. It was slow, it was messy, and many times it was very funny. I started by surrounding myself with the language. I changed the language on my phone to English. For the first 2 days, I couldn't even find my messages. I had to guess where the buttons were. I put sticky notes on everything in my house. My mirror said mirror, my fridge said refrigerator, my cat even had a little sign on his bed that said cat. I started listening to English everywhere. I found a YouTube channel called English Cat. I would listen to the stories while I cooked dinner or while I washed my hair. At first, it sounded like a fast stream of water. I couldn't tell where one word ended and another began. But I didn't stop. I told myself, just keep listening. Your brain is a computer, and you are installing new software. One of the hardest parts was pronunciation. I spent hours in front of the mirror trying to make the th sound. I felt like a snake hissing at my own reflection. My roommate walked in once and asked if I was okay. I told her, I am practicing my tongue. She laughed and said I looked crazy. I didn't mind. I realized that to learn a new language, you have to be willing to look a little bit crazy. You have to be willing to be a beginner. I started speaking to myself. I would narrate my day like I was in a reality show. Now I am making coffee. The coffee is hot. I like coffee. It felt simple, but it helped my mouth get used to the new shapes of the words. But speaking to other people was a different story. The first time I tried to use an English app to talk to a language partner, I was so nervous that I forgot my own name. The person on the screen said, "Hi, how are you?" I stared at them for 10 seconds and then closed the laptop. I sat in the dark, my heart racing. I felt embarrassed. I thought, I will never be able to do this. I am 26 years old and I'm scared of a computer screen. But the next day, I tried again. I typed, I am nervous, sorry. The person replied, don't worry, I am nervous too. That simple sentence changed everything. I realized that everyone else was also struggling. We were all in the same boat, trying to navigate a huge ocean. I made so many mistakes. Once, I tried to tell a new friend that I was embarrassed about my English, but I used a word that sounded like pregnant in another language I knew. They looked at me with wide eyes and said, "Congratulations." I was so confused until I realized what I had said. We both laughed until we had tears in our eyes. Those moments taught me that mistakes are not failures. Mistakes are the way we learn. Every time I said something wrong, the correct way burned into my memory. I also started watching movies. I watched the same movie 5 times. The first time, I used subtitles in my own language. The second time, I used English subtitles. By the 5th time, I turned them off completely. When I understood a joke without reading it, I jumped off my sofa and cheered. It was a small victory, but it felt like winning an Olympic medal. My world was starting to grow. The wall was still there, but I was starting to see cracks in it. I could see light coming through. Progress is a strange thing. It doesn't happen in a straight line. Sometimes I felt like I was flying, and other times I felt like I had forgotten everything I ever learned. But slowly, the good days started to happen more often than the bad days. I remember the first time I understood a whole song on the radio. I was driving to work and a pop song came on. Usually, I just liked the melody, but this time I understood the story. I understood that the singer was sad because someone had left him. I felt his emotion. I wasn't just hearing sounds, I was hearing feelings. Then came the day of the first real conversation. I was at the airport waiting for my sister. A man near me was looking at a map and looking very frustrated. He looked at me and asked, "Do you know which bus goes to the city center?" In the past, I would have looked at the floor and walked away, but this time I took a deep breath. I said, "Yes, you need the number 202. It stops right outside that door." He smiled and said, "Thank you so much. Your English is great. Have a nice day." He walked away and I stayed there, frozen. He thought my English was great. He understood me. I had helped a human being using this new tool. I felt a surge of confidence that was more powerful than any cup of coffee. I wasn't just a student anymore, I was a communicator. I started to feel a change in my personality too. In my native language, I was often shy, but in English, I felt like I could be a bit more adventurous. I joined an online book club for English learners. We read a simple version of a famous novel. When it was my turn to speak during our video call, my voice didn't shake as much. I shared my opinion about the main character. I said, I think she is brave because she follows her heart. Another woman from Brazil agreed with me. We talked for 20 minutes about bravery and love. I realized that English was giving me a new way to see myself. I wasn't just the person who worked in a small office. I was a person who had friends in Brazil, Italy, and Japan. I was a person who could understand different perspectives. My confidence began to spill over into other parts of my life. At work, I started volunteering for projects that involved international emails. My boss noticed the change. He said, "You seem much more sure of yourself lately. What is your secret?" I just smiled and said, "I am just learning to speak up." I started to enjoy the process of learning. It wasn't a chore anymore, it was a hobby. I loved finding new idioms. I loved learning that you could say, "It's a piece of cake," instead of, "It's easy." I loved the way the language felt in my mouth. My thoughts even started to shift. Sometimes I would catch myself thinking in English. I would think, "I need to buy milk," instead of thinking it in my native tongue. When that happened, I knew that the language was becoming a part of my soul. It wasn't an external thing anymore. It was living inside me. The cracks in the wall were getting wider and wider, and I could finally see the beautiful, busy world on the other side. The major turning point in my life came about a year after I started my journey. A position opened up at a large international organization in the city. It was the kind of job I used to dream about, but always thought was impossible for me. The job required high-level coordination and, of course, excellent English. This time, I didn't hesitate. I spent 3 days writing my resume and cover letter in English. I checked every word. I used every resource I had. When I pressed the send button, I felt a sense of peace. Even if I didn't get the job, I was proud of myself for trying. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a glass-walled office for an interview. There were 3 people on the panel. One was from England, one was from the United States, and one was from my country. They asked me difficult questions about my experience and my goals. I didn't have perfect grammar. I struggled to find a few words, but I didn't panic. When I didn't know a word, I explained it. I said, "I can't remember the specific name for this, but it is the process of making things work faster." They nodded and understood. At the end of the interview, the woman from England looked at me and said, "You have a very clear way of expressing yourself. We appreciate your honesty and your effort." A week later, they offered me the job. I sat at my kitchen table and held the offer letter. I cried, but they were happy tears. This job changed my financial life, but more importantly, it changed my identity. I was no longer the assistant who was afraid of a manual. I was a professional working in a global environment. My new job took me to a conference in London. It was my first time leaving my country. I remember walking through the streets of London, hearing English everywhere. It was like being in a movie. I walked into a bookstore and bought a novel in its original English version. I sat in a park and read the first chapter. I understood almost everything. I looked at the people walking by and felt a deep connection to them. I wasn't a stranger, I was a part of this. I made friends from all over the world. I met a man from Germany and a woman from Thailand. We sat together at dinner and talked for hours. We didn't talk about English, we talked about our lives, our dreams, and our families. We used English to share our hearts. I realized that this was the real power of the language. It wasn't about being perfect, it wasn't about sounding like a native speaker. It was about the human connection that happens when 2 people from different worlds can finally understand each other. Because I learned English, I was also able to help my own family. I helped my younger brother with his homework. I helped my parents understand the documents for their vacation. I became the bridge for them too. My world had expanded from one small town to the entire planet. I felt like I had been given a new pair of eyes. Everything looked different. Everything looked possible. I started thinking about starting my own small business, something I would never have dared to do before. English had opened the door, and I was finally brave enough to walk through it. Now, I look back at the person I was 2 years ago, and I almost don't recognize her. That woman was so afraid. She was so quiet. She thought her life was small because she didn't have the words to make it big. If I could go back and talk to her, I would give her a hug and tell her that everything is going to be okay. I would tell her that the struggle is worth it. I would tell her that every mistake is a step toward freedom. Learning English didn't just give me a better job or the ability to travel, it changed my mindset. It taught me that I can learn anything if I am patient and persistent. It taught me that I am much stronger than I thought. Before, I used to see a challenge and think, I can't do that. Now I see a challenge and think, I haven't learned how to do that yet. That small change in words makes a huge difference in life. My life is no longer a translated life. It is my life, lived in full color and high volume. I can read the books I want to read. I can listen to the music I want to listen to. I can speak to almost anyone on this earth. The wall that used to surround me is completely gone. In its place, there are endless roads leading in every direction. I feel a sense of peace that I never thought I would find. I am no longer watching the world from a distance. I am standing in the middle of it. To anyone who is listening to this, I want you to know that you can do this too. I know it is hard. I know there are days when you want to throw your books out the window. I know there are moments when you feel like you are not making any progress. But please, don't stop. Every minute you spend listening, every word you look up, and every time you practice speaking, you are building your own bridge. You are breaking down your own walls. Don't worry about being perfect. Perfection is a trap. The goal is not to be perfect. The goal is to be understood. The goal is to connect. The world doesn't need more people who speak perfect English. The world needs more people who are brave enough to share their stories, even with a few mistakes. Your voice matters. Your ideas matter. And English is the tool that will help you share them with all of us. As I sit here today, I am so grateful for that yellow notebook and that difficult first night of studying. Learning English was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it was also the best thing I have ever done. It gave me the world and it gave me myself. Take a deep breath. Keep going. I promise you the view from the other side is more beautiful than you can ever imagine. You are doing a great job, and your future is waiting for you. Just keep listening, keep practicing, and keep believing in yourself.